Hello and welcome to From the Therapy Room. This is a space where we slow down together, where we look gently at the inner landscape of the mind, not to judge ourselves, but to understand ourselves a little more deeply. Because often the struggles we carry inside us are not signs that something is wrong with us, they're signs that something within us is asking to be seen, understood, and integrated. Have you ever noticed how the mind sometimes refuses to let go of certain moments? A conversation you had years ago, something someone said to you, an argument, an embarrassing moment, or even a mistake you made long ago. You may be driving, cooking, or trying to fall asleep, and suddenly the memory returns. And along with the memory comes the same thought. Why did I say that? Why did that happen? Or what should I have done differently? The strange thing is, even when life has moved forward and the mind sometimes keeps revisiting the same moment again and again, almost as if the memory is still unfinished. But what if the mind is not replaying the past to punish you? What if it is actually trying to process something that never fully understood? Today, we are going to explore the psychology behind why the mind keeps replaying certain memories, why some moments stay with us for years. Why does the mind keep replaying these things? And what those returning memories may actually be trying to tell us. Today, we'll explore this deeply, psychologically, emotionally, and philosophically. Most people assume that memories simply sit quietly in the mind like photographs stored in an album. But psychologically, that is not how memory works. Memories are living processes, not static recordings. And the mind does something interesting. It tends to revisit experiences that are emotionally unfinished. The mind is not obsessed with the past, it is obsessed with resolution. So, when sometime meaningful happens in our life that the psyche cannot fully process in that moment, the mind keeps returning to it. In psychology, this is often related to what is called rumination. Rumination is the repetitive replaying of thoughts, memories, or conversations in the mind. And studies show that rumination is closely linked to anxiety, depression, unresolved emotional conflict, and trauma processing. But rumination is not simply overthinking. Often it is an unconscious attempt to make sense of something that once overwhelmed us. The mind is simply asking, what exactly happened there? What did that moment mean about me? Why did it hurt so much? So the memory returns again and again. We need to understand that why the brain replays experiences. And one way to understand why the mind replays memory is to look at how the human brain evolved. Thousands of years ago, survival depended on learning deeply from past experiences. If something dangerous happened, a predator, a betrayal in the tribe, a mistake in judgment, the brain needed to remember it very clearly. So the brain evolved a system that says, pay attention to emotionally intense events. They may contain important lessons. In evolutionary psychology, rumination is sometimes described as the brain's attempt to learn from social and emotional mistakes. Because in human history, social belonging was essential for survival. Being rejected by the tribe could literally mean death. So, when something socially painful happens, like embarrassment, rejection, conflict, the brain may replay that moment repeatedly, trying to extract a lesson. And unfortunately, the modern brain sometimes overuse this system. Instead of learning once and moving forward, the mind gets trapped in repetitive analysis. It keeps asking, what should I have done differently? What did they think of me? Or why did that happen? So, rumination is not simply weakness, it's it is an ancient learning mechanism that sometimes become overactive in modern lives. And one of the most important discoveries in neuroscience is the emotion determines what the brain remembers. Research from neuroscientists like Joseph Ledoux and others studying the amygdala shows that emotionally intense experiences are encoded differently in the brain. So, when something deeply emotional happens, the brain marks that memory as important. It becomes easier to recall, more vivid, more persistent, which is why a random day from 5 years ago may disappear from memory, but one painful conversation stays crystal clear. The brain is essentially saying, this moment mattered. The problem is that the brain does not distinguish between important memories that help us grow and painful memories that keeps us stuck. It simply stores emotional intensity. Another fascinating discovery in neuroscience relates to something called the default mode network, often abbreviated as the DMN. This is a network of brain regions that become active when the mind is not focused on external tasks. In other words, when you're not working, not solving a problem, or not actively concentrating, the brain enters its default mode. And what does it do in this default mode? It starts thinking about the past, the future, the relationships, identity, and social experiences. The default mode network is essentially brain's self reflection system. It helps us construct our life story. But when someone is experiencing anxiety, depression, or unresolved emotional pain, the, the DMN can become hyperactive. This is when people experience repetitive thinking, mental replaying of conversations, overanalyzing past events, or intrusive memories. Studies from researchers like Marcus Rachel have shown that this network plays a significant role in self referential thinking, which means the brain constantly asks, what does this mean about me? So, when the mind replays a memory, it is often trying to update the story we tell about ourselves. In therapy, we often see a pattern. When a memory keeps replaying, it is usually not the event itself that the psyche is holding on to. It is the meaning the person made about themselves in that particular moment. For example, someone remembers a moment where a partner criticized them, but what the mind is really replaying is a deeper question: am I not good enough? Or another person remembers being ignored in a meeting at work, but underneath the memory lives the narrative: maybe my voice doesn't matter. So the memory keeps returning because the psyche is still wrestling with that meaning. Human beings are storytelling creatures. We do not simply remember events, we build narrative around them. For example, two people may experience the exact same event. One may say, that moment taught me resilience, and another may say, that moment proved I'm not good enough. The event is the same, but the story attached to the event becomes very different. And psychologists refer to this as narrative identity. Our sense of self is built through the stories we create about our experiences. And sometimes, when the mind keeps replaying a memory, it is because the psyche is still trying to understand what that experience meant for our identity. And sometimes memories replay not as thoughts but as emotional stats. This is known as emotional flashbacks. We have talked about during our last episode. Where you may suddenly feel shame, embarrassment, guilt, abandonment without understanding why. Often this emotional state is linked to a past memory. But the brain does not always replay the full memory. Instead, it replays the emotions. This is especially common in people who have experienced childhood emotional wounds. The body remembers, even when the mind has forgotten the details. There is actually a very fascinating psychological study that explains why the mind hates incomplete stories. In the 1920s, a psychologist, Bluma Zeigarnik, discovered something now called the Zeigarnik effect. And she found that people remembers unfinished tasks far more than the completed ones. So when something remains incomplete, the brain keeps returning to it, almost like a mental notification saying this is still open. Emotional experience work the same way. An unresolved conflict, an unsaid truth, an apology that never came, a question that was never answered. These moments remain psychologically open, so the mind keep revisiting them. When the mind is caught in a rumination loop, it often does not feel dramatic or obvious. It can appear very subtle, almost like the mind is simply thinking things through. But slowly, these patterns begin to reveal that the mind is not really resolving the experience, it's kind of circling around it. There are some subtle signs your mind maybe is stuck. How you can identify, I mean, uh, for that, there are some subtle signs that your mind is in a kind of rumination loop, like replaying conversation repeatedly, one sign of like that. Because one of the most common sign of rumination is the mind repeatedly returning to a past conversation. You may find yourself mentally replaying exact words that were said, the tone of someone's voice, or even the expressions on their face. Sometimes the mind pauses at a specific moments, almost as if it is trying to decode them. What did they really meant by that? Or did I sound defensive? Or did they misunderstood me? And in small doses, reflecting on conversation can be helpful. It allows us to learn about ourselves and a relationship. But when the mind keeps replaying the same interaction again and again without arriving at a new understanding, it often signals that something emotional inside that moment still feels unresolved. And the mind is trying to process an emotional meaning, not just the words that were spoken. Another sign is thinking about what you should have said. I mean, our mind is continuously rewriting the past. You might imagine different versions of the conversation, what I should have said, I should have explained in this way or in that way, or if I had responded differently, maybe things would have changed. So, this mental rewriting can feel like the mind is trying to regain control over a situation that once felt uncomfortable or disempowering. In psychology, this sometimes reflects the psyche's attempt to repair a moment where we felt unheard, embarrassed, or powerless. But because the past cannot actually be changed, the mind never reaches closer. It keeps revisiting the scenes, searching for the better outcomes that cannot occur anymore. And the result is a loop where the mind is really not solving anything. It is simply revisiting an emotional wound. A key characteristic of rumination is that the emotional response remains exactly the same every time. the memory appears. For example, when memory surface, you may feel embarrassment, shame, anger, regret, or rejection. And what is interesting is that the body often reacts as if the event is happening right now, even though it may have happened months or years ago. This happens because emotional memories are stored not only in the mind but also in the nervous system. The memory activates the same emotional pathway each time it appears, which is why the feeling can return with such intensity. So, until the emotional meaning of the experience is processed, the mind keeps triggering the same emotional state again and again. And fourth subtle point is that rumination often disguises itself as problem solving because the mind believes it is trying to understand what happened, but instead of moving toward inside, the thinking becomes circular. You may notice thoughts like, why did this happen? Or what did they mean? Or what does this say about me? And the mind keeps examining the same detail over and over, but the thinking does not lead to new perspective or any kind of emotional relief. Instead, it leads back to the same confusion. This is one of the defining feature of rumination. The mind keeps analyzing, but no resolution emerges. It is as if the mind is walking in circle inside the same mental room. Perhaps the clearest signal of rumination is the sense of mental exhaustion that follows. Because after spending time thinking about memory, you may notice that you feel drained rather than relieved. Your mind may feel heavy or tired. You may even say to yourself, why am I still thinking about it? Why? And this exhaustion happens because rumination consumes a great deal of cognitive and emotional energy. And the mind is continuously activating the same neural pathways without arriving at closure. Over time, this can increase stress, anxiety, and emotional fatigue. The mind is working very hard, but it is not moving forward. And when we notice these signs, it is important not to criticize ourselves for them. Rumination is often the mind's attempt to make sense of an emotionally significant experience. It is the psyche saying, there is something here that is still needs understanding. And sometimes, when we begin to approach these memory with curiosity and compassion rather than judgment, the mind slowly learns that is no longer need to keep replaying the same moment again and again. Most people believe therapy means forgetting painful experiences, but this is rarely how healing happens. Healing often happens when the person is able to revisit the memory with a different emotional environment. So instead of facing the memory alone, the person now has a compassionate witness, emotional safety, and psychological understanding. And slowly, something shifts. The memory that once felt overwhelming becomes integrated into the larger story of a person's life. Instead, this moment defines me. Instead of that, we think that this moment defines me, it becomes this moment shaped me, but it is not the whole who I am. And when the psyche finally feels understood, something remarkably happens. The memory often stops replaying as frequently because the emotional work has been completed. This pattern shows up very often in therapy room. I remember a client once telling me something that many people quietly experience. He said there is this one conversation from years ago that keep coming back to me. I don't even know why. Nothing dramatic happened, but I still replay it in my mind. And he described a moment from nearly 10 years earlier. He has been in a meeting at work. He shared an idea, and someone in the room dismissed it casually and moved on. Nothing explosive happened. The meeting ended, life moved forward, but his mind kept returning to that moment, sometimes while driving, sometimes before falling asleep, and each time the same thought would appear. Maybe what I said was stupid. Maybe people think I'm not intelligent enough. And later, when we explored the memory together, something deeper slowly surfaced. The moment itself was not the real wound. What the moment touched was much older emotional story. A story he had quietly carried since childhood. My voice doesn't really matter. And once that deeper meaning became visible, the memory started to make sense. The mind had not been replaying the meeting, the mind has been replaying a question about self worth. And when the question was finally explored with compassion, something softened. And slowly, over time, the memory stopped appearing as often. Not because it was forgotten, but because it has finally been understood. Often, the person never had the chance to fully feel emotional truth of that moment. Perhaps they were too young. Perhaps they had to stay strong. Perhaps they suppressed the feeling. Or perhaps no one validated their experience. So the psyche carries the moment as unfinished, and the mind keeps replaying it, not to torture the person, but to invite completion. And therapy becomes the space where the memory can finally be processed, where the person can say what they couldn't say then, feel what they couldn't feel then, and understand what they couldn't understand then. Another fascinating discovery in neuroscience is sometimes called memory reconsolidation. Each time we remember something, the brain briefly reopens the memory. And during that moment, the meaning of the memory can change. This means memories are not fixed, they evolve, which is why healing is possible. So, in therapy, when someone revisits a painful memory with compassion and understanding, the emotional charge of the memory can slowly change. The event stays the same, but the meaning transforms. Instead of I was weak, the story becomes I was doing the best I could with what I knew. And instead of they rejected me because I'm not worthy, the meanings become they were limited in ways I couldn't see at that time. This is how emotional healing happens, not by erasing memories, but by transforming the stories attached to them. And interestingly, the mind doesn't only replay painful memories, sometimes it revisits beautiful ones too. A conversation, a moment of love, a day you felt truly alive. Why? Because the psyche longs to reconnect with meaningful emotional states. These memory reminds the nervous system of safety, belonging, and joy. They become our emotional anchors, and in difficult times, the mind instinctively return to them. However, not every replay of memory is healthy. There is an important difference between reflection and rumination. Reflection helps us understand ourselves, and rumination keeps us stuck in self-criticism. Reflection asks, what did this experience teach me? And rumination asks, why am like this? Reflection brings insight, and rumination deepens shame. The challenge is that many people think that they are processing something when they are actually just replaying the pain, which is why the mind feels exhausted but unchanged. When a memory keeps returning, it is often asking one of these deeper questions. What did this moment mean about me? Or what did I need in that moment that I didn't receive? Or what part of me is still hurting there? Or what truth did I silence back then? Or sometimes simply, can I now see this moment with more compassion? The mind is not stuck in the past, it is searching for emotional integration. If you notice your mind replaying a certain memory often, try a small reflective exercise. Instead of pushing the memory away, sit quietly and ask yourself three questions. First, what emotion is present in this memory? Second, what did I need in that moment that I did not receive? And third, what should I say to the version of myself who lived through that moment? And sometimes the mind is not asking us to analyze the memory. Sometimes it is simply asking us to offer compassion to the person we once were. So instead of fighting the memory, try approaching it differently. When the memory returns, pause and ask, what is this memory trying to show me? What emotion is asking to be acknowledged? And what younger version of me lived through this moment? Often the mind is inviting you to do something very simple but very powerful, to meet the moment with compassion. Because healing does not happen when we push memories away. Healing happens when we can finally look at them without abandoning ourselves. There is a beautiful quote by a psychologist called Jung: until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Sometimes the memory that return again are simply part of our story asking to be understood, not judged, not suppressed, but gently integrated into who we are becoming. Your mind is not your enemy. It is often your psyche's way of saying, there is something here worth understanding. Perhaps the mind is not replaying certain memories to keep us trapped in the past. Perhaps it is doing something much more human. It is trying to finish a conversation that was never fully heard, or to understand a moment that was once felt confusing, or to bring compassion to a part of us that once stood alone. Or the memories that return again and again are often not asking us to relive the pain. They're simply asking us to see the person we were in that moment with greater kindness. And when that happens, something quite begins to change inside us. The memory may still exist, but it no longer carries the same weight. Because what the mind was searching for was never really an answer, it was the understanding. And sometimes healing does not mean forgetting the past. Sometimes healing simply means the past no longer needs to keep knocking on the door of present. If this episode resonated with something inside you, perhaps take a moment today to sit quietly with one memory that often returns, not to analyze it, not to criticize yourself, but simply to listen to what that moment might still be trying to tell you. Because sometimes the past returns not to haunt us, but to help us become more whole. Thank you for spending the time with me. Until the next time, take care of your inner world. Next time, I'll be sitting just next besides you. See you. Take care.